and welcome to another developer interview for our Perceptive Podcast series. My guest tonight is working on their first game, and it's going to be more on the storytelling visual novel side with Night Shift 1999. And they're on to chat about that, as well as kind of going from contemporary arts to making a game. So please welcome to the podcast, Georgina. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
Not a problem. And this is Georgina's first time doing a developer interview. And this is, of course, your first game. So it is a pleasure to have you. And again, thank you so much for wanting to come on and chat about it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's really nice to be able to support other people in the space, whether they're developers or podcasters or anything in between.
hmm And as I always tell everyone, if you are watching this and interested in coming on to talk about your game or some aspect of game dev, be sure to reach out. We're always looking for guests. So, we are dealing with not only the time zone challenge, as they are based out of Australia, but I'm also dealing with thunderstorm challenges. So the lights may be flickering and other things during this call, but we'll see how things go. So, since this is your first time on a cast, as I always start things off, could you talk a little bit about kind of who you are and what is your background in terms of like either game dev or like kind of getting into game dev?
I've really come from academia, and specifically in the fine arts. So before I actually started developing this game and before I got funding to develop the game, I was going on to do my PhD in London. And so that was all about installation art and specifically talking kind of about data colonization and privacy laws and how that intersects with the fine arts industry. So this was a big change. Although I have, for my various art projects, kind of dabbled in some programming and stuff like that, but just not to this extent.
Hmm. And for people listening, what is Night Shift 1999 about?
So it's a visual novel. It's about a vampire moving to King's Cross, Sydney in 1999. And so you can kind of guess where the title of the game comes from. Seeing as you're a vampire, you do have to get a job. You've got to pay your bills. You've got to do all the things that like a mundane, ordinary human does. But you're obviously limited by the circumstances of your supernatural happenings.
And with this kind of being like your first game, as well as moving from doing like fine arts to video games, what kind of like, I guess, first of all, what kind of attracted you to making a visual novel as kind of your first project?
When I was considering, because if I had the story idea primarily for a very long time, and I did want to eventually, like I've always been interested in game making. I just never had the chance to do a large scale project. It was mostly just doing again like small things for university, kind of on my own time. But when I was considering pitching this game idea to Screen Australia, to get funding to create a demo for it, I was really thinking like, what is kind of, what are my programming skills up to doing? And I was like, well, even though I can personally do 3D modeling and things like that, I wanted to do a 2D game. I didn't want the scope of the project to get too large that as a one person team, like I can't handle it. So that's why I thought this is a story that, like, yeah, it can be told in like different genres, of game, but I feel like a visual novel is kind of the best way to tell it and the best way for me to make my debut.
hmm And you're not the first of all, right? Someone with who had like a fine art or came from another kind of background to get into game dev, and it's always interesting, like kind of like see like people make that move into the game dev space. I guess with as you're describing with the visual novel side, like this is not the first time I've heard that from like people trying to get in, and we've seen so
Yeah.
much over like the past decade of more visual novel style games, more games focused more on storytelling rather than rapid fire gameplay or reflex driven that kind of thing. I guess from like as you're working on Night Shift, what engine did you decide to use? Like, did you use like a Twine or something else to build the game?
I actually write. So I write all of the, like, I do all the dialogue branches and things like that in Twine, but I've been
Mhm.
using Unity to build
Okay.
it.
All right. Yeah,
Yeah.
man. We've seen so much in terms of like having so many more like easier to use software these days, especially again like the last like 5 to 7 years with more stuff going into stuff like Godot, Unity, of course, and that kind of thing. I guess as like this being like your first game and like your first actual project, what was it like moving into game dev or learning it for the first time?
Yeah, it was really interesting because I hadn't used Unity before. I also hadn't, like, I'd only used Java, like I'd only learned JavaScript. So I was learning C sharp for the first time too. And I suppose when you take on a project like this, I was lucky that in my fine art career, I'm used to working on my own and also having to manage, large scale projects. So I was able to have some of the organizational skills that you definitely need, and the self-discipline in order to actually meet the goals that you have set out for yourself, but also when you have funding in the question that, a government body sets out for you as well, while still like learning a new skill basically. And just kind of putting it all together. But no, I mean, I suppose it's been a bit unconventional because I know that a lot of my peers that I've started to get to know, like in conventions and stuff like that, they're usually in conversation a lot with each other. There's quite a lot of, I suppose, help within the industry. Like, indie devs kind of stick together. And so I I not only did I move interstate at the same time that I started this project, but already I'm not like I'm Swiss born, so I'm not Australian. So I wasn't really connected to the game dev scene. And it was only once I started going to conventions and things like that that I started like kind of being able to get feedback and being able to talk to my contemporaries, and I suppose have the community side of things that I was lacking when I first built the demo.
Hmm. You said you had this idea for the story for a long time. How long have you been working, like actively working on Night Shift?
Actively working, it's only been since January of last year. But the story formed when I first moved to Sydney in 2019, because I was thinking while I was doing all the beats of actually moving, and especially setting up like not only like in a new like part of my life going into university and things like that, but also just being in a new country. I was thinking like, damn, I've always really liked I suppose like vampire media and things like that. And I thought when you're immortal, you probably have to be doing that constantly, just like in the sense of like moving through time and having to get used to new time periods. And so that's where the core of like the story came from, was just me thinking about that while I was doing my first year of university. But I never actually like wrote down anything or did any like sketches or things like that until January 2025.
Hmm. And with kind of like coming up with the gameplay side of things, again, with this being predominantly a visual novel, what are like some of the aspects like that someone will be able to get into with playing Night Shift?
I think the biggest selling point for it really is the fact that like it is a visual novel, and I know some visual novels tend to be quite direct, and there's no split routes and things like that. Like you have one story and you play through the story. And in the visual novel genre, like there's obviously a lot of different ways that it kind of manifests. You also have different games that employ like point and click aspects, things like that. In Night Shift, it is quite like the story definitely responds to your choices. So you're constantly making choices as to what locations and areas you want to explore, how you want to talk to people and like interact with the other characters in the game. And as you do so, it retroactively builds like your character's background. Because each time you end the day, you end up getting sequences of like memories of the past that come through as dreams. And so even though you're playing and you're shaping what ending you're getting, because there's 11 different endings in the actual game, you're also shaping kind of the past events that your character went through. So in that aspect, even though you're playing a set character too, there's still a customizable, point in the game.
And with kind of like devising the multiple endings, what was that like in terms of like writing like how you want like each path to go?
Yeah, how I approached it is I thought about all of the characters that you interact with as different reflections of the main character, and like so different reflections of yourself and things that you kind of need to settle with in order to either, like, I suppose, move on, like embrace what happened in the past and move on, or to just kind of cling on to the past and have that hanging over you. And so there's no like bad endings, quote unquote. But there's more satisfaction depending on like how you've interacted with characters and if you've opened yourself up to kind of meeting them on their level, rather than, projecting, I suppose, the character's baggage. And so that's how I was figuring out the endings of the story. Like, it is based around an epilogue because if you start the game on New Year's Eve, well, on New Year's Day, technically, because it's after 12 a.m., and you are ending it on New Year's Eve of like, 2000, of 1999 going into 2000s. And so all of the endings are centralized around that party that you throw. And so then that depends on how you've interacted with people in the span of that time frame of the year. And yeah.
Hmm. And looking at the store page, I like the 1-bit art that you have for it. What was that like coming up with the art style that you wanted for Night Shift?
Yeah, so I've always loved pixel art, and this has been my first time doing pixel art. But I just kind of felt like I know obviously in the 90s, especially 99, we were having 3D graphics and like we had color, you know what I mean? But I did think that in a way it does kind of give that like retro nostalgia feel, which I suppose more and more people are kind of having for like the 90s in particular, but also before that. And so, yeah, it was kind of trying to fit in with like people's perception, especially of people that weren't alive during the 90s, of like perhaps what games were like back then. Not only is it kind of also a homage because it's my first time making a game, I wanted to kind of be an ode to the first like iteration of games. And then also when I was coming up with the color palette, that went through a couple of different iterations. Initially, I was going to go like for 32-bit. I wanted it to have like a kind of full range of colors. But as I was drawing the backgrounds and things like that, I was realizing that, I don't know, it kind of felt a bit laborious to look at. And I was, at the same time, I was doing research into other vampire media. And so I was watching the original Nosferatu movie. Obviously, that was in black and white, and it was a silent film. And also, like visual novels in general, like especially when you don't have voice acting and things like that, they kind of are like silent movies. Like visual novels themselves are quite reminiscent of graphic novels and also like silent film. It, like a lot of different things put into one. And so I thought, you're already like moving through this space as like this vampire living completely in darkness, moving completely through the night, having it be devoid of color, I suppose it really signifies the fact that you're living in a separate reality than most people are operating under.
Yeah, as you're talking about kind of like the different like styles you can have with pixel art, I loaded up as a bit of contrast, like Return of the Obra Dinn, looking at the store page for that, and that has like far
Yeah, yeah.
high detail pixel art. And yeah, like that can get very like cluttered. It can be like very much like over simulation in some cases.
Yeah, totally. I think that's especially like I know with dithering especially, and that's something that I was playing around with my backgrounds, and then I ultimately decided to avoid doing any dithering in the actual backgrounds themselves. Like I'll have dithering only for the character sprites in certain places, for I suppose more outfit reasons to try and give the idea of texture. Because when you're especially looking at black and white for such a long time, it can get very visually overstimulating. And I feel like, especially with the canvas sizes that I've been using, it's like they're not gigantic like pixel art canvases. So I didn't want it to be too overwhelming to look at, especially when you're in for the long run, because if you're reading this and you're going to be reading this for a while.
Hmm. From a writing point of view, have you done any kind of like fictional writing in the past, or is this like your first time writing like a fictional story?
Yeah, this is my first time writing a fictional story too. I've only done like nonfiction writing up until now, and that's been for like, like a thesis and things like that.
Mm. And like, how was that like? I guess like learning how to do storytelling, not only just like writing a story, but then applying that to video games as a medium.
Yeah, I suppose like kind of the journey that I went on is that I've always been a big believer that in order to write well, you also need to be able to read well. And so I tried to surround myself with as much fiction as possible. Like so, even though I read Dracula like in high school, I decided to reread it. I decided to kind of like go through the ropes of and like it was the same with like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and everything like that. I was like deciding to go through, read all this nonfiction, especially in like I suppose the gothic horror genre, and kind of see the way that storytelling was applied in those books, and then see like how I was going to apply it in my own writing, especially because this is a first person game and it's a first person writing style. I wanted it to feel like it was cohesive, rather than just, purely academic text, and still like an enjoyable story to go through. And you can have a strong character voice, but without it being too removed, especially since this character is, coming from the 1800s. There is a different language style that's deployed there. And I didn't want it to be like, I wanted it to be a mix of, I suppose like modern for the 90s, terminology, while also still like paying reference to the character's origins. So it was a tough balance to handle.
And with like learning game dev at the same time, I always like to ask like new developers, like, what was it kind of like learning about like the game dev side, like learning about what engine you wanted to use, how you wanted to build the game, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, for me, I relied on YouTube a lot, and thankfully, especially, I don't really know how it is for other types of games, but thankfully for visual novels, there's like a wealth of resources
Mhm.
out there, and so it was very easy for me to kind of look and see like what engines people were using, what people were suggesting, and also what tutorials they were making, like for like specific engines and stuff like that. So that's how I chose Unity, just because I found a very cohesive, and it was like it was a very long crash course, and I use that term loosely because it was like about 80 hours, in order to like that just show you the ropes of how to use it, how to also like make sure that Unity is kind of set up for actually building your visual novel, because obviously it's not a lot of developers I know use RenPy or RenPy, depends on how you pronounce it. But yeah, it was just YouTube and Reddit and things like that, and seeing what other devs were doing, and then applying it for my own project.
With like where the game is right now, we are recording this kind of near the end of May. Do you and there is a demo available. Do you have like an estimated release date for the game now, or is that still kind of hush hush?
That is hush hush for the moment, just because of there is an announcement coming, that's coming in June. But yes, it is relatively soon that it's going to be released.
All right. And before we talk a little bit more about kind of the funding aspect of it, anything else you want to mention in terms of the design or the storytelling of a night shift before we kind of switch over to our other topic?
I suppose in terms of the design and things like that, it's a story that's quite personal to me because of it is like even though I wanted this game to be kind of whatever you want it to be, like when you approach it, there's obviously always going to be intent on my side of what the game is and like how the story's been built. And so, from my perspective, it's really a story about the struggles of actually migrating and things like that. It's about, and that can be applied to migrating countries, or that can be in terms of moving interstate or to different cities, or even into a different phase of your life. But it's all about trying to like start over, set yourself up, and also kind of find your place in the world, and everything that comes with that. And how do you actually go about doing that? So that's really what it is, even though it's obviously got this supernatural element where you've got ghosts and werewolves and vampires and everything. And then from the art side of things, because of I was building it based off of kind of around my experiences of moving, and just like kind of those struggles that I had initially, all of the art has been like kind of cross-referenced between photography that I took during my first year of university, as well as like going through archives, because thankfully King's Cross is kind of a very iconic city, and so there's a lot of people that are very dedicated to preserving the history of it. So there's a huge amount of archival newspapers, photographs, all sorts around the area. So it was really fun being able to kind of build a version of what, King's Cross and the surrounding neighborhoods and suburbs would look like in 99, based off of my own references that I took, as well as what other people preserved, and, kind of creating a blend of that. And I suppose that speaks to, how subjective experience and memory is.
And I was just having a conversation with another developer in real time as we're recording this, not when this cast goes up, and we were talking about just
Okay.
how much more like globalized it has been in terms of game development and being able to create games in the past 10 years. And
Yes.
having a game kind of based out of Australia in 19, of course, in 1999 is a very
Yeah.
interesting aspect. It's not something that we usually get to see. I mean, I've interviewed developers who have made games based in everywhere from Jamaica to Africa. I play a really great one about exploring like 90s Tokyo that I think came out relatively
Oh, cool.
soon by the time we were recording this. And it's always fascinating to see just like so many or so much variety when it comes to topics and where these games can be placed out. Because again, like for people listening, they know I play tons and tons of action games. I have played all the Souls likes and roguelikes and all that. But I always do love to play games that do something differently or have a different kind of story to them. I always find that very interesting to look at.
It is something that's been quite cool. And I know, I suppose this is just coming from the funding side of things, because of when I was doing my application, and also when I've been doing applications for further funding for the game. It is interesting that I suppose Australian developers haven't really been making games set in Australia, and that's something that I get even when I go to conventions and talk to other Australians, is a lot of them are like, "Oh wow, I haven't actually played a game or seen a game that's set here." And that doesn't really like discriminate depending on the state. And that's also something that's been reflected in Screen Australia's funding reports, is that there's a very small percentage of games that are coming forth, like game ideas that actually are set in the country. And so I suppose I hope that more Australian developers do decide to create games set here, because there's a huge amount that you can play with. And also, I mean, I don't know, it's a country with a very complicated and very rich history, and there's a huge amount that we should be doing, I suppose, in terms of just doing awareness of around the different areas and its histories.
One other thing that I wanted to ask you, like regarding the writing for the game, before I forget, in terms of
Yep.
the endings themselves, or creating like the actual pacing of the game, this is something that I
Yes.
like to ask a lot of visual novel and story based developers, because there's always that kind of challenge, especially with a medium like visual novel, that you can just write endlessly. If you have Twine open, you can
Yeah.
just keep typing up plots, keep typing things up. It's a very much that same kind of siren song that I talk to a lot of action and RPG developers about. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who's, of course, doing a lot of writing and doing the story for the game, how do you settle on how long the game has to be or how long the game needs to be before you're just kind of adding stuff for the sake of adding stuff?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've considered a lot, especially because the game does take place over the course of a year. I was like, I'm not going to be like number one rule is like I'm not going to be actually writing a day by day diary for this character that you're going to be playing through. Otherwise, that is just like literally impossible to ever finish. So the way I approached it was I said, okay, I'm going to be splitting this up into 4 chapters. So you have, and that's based on the seasons. So you start in summer, obviously, because of it's in the Southern Hemisphere. Start in summer, go into autumn, go into winter, go into spring, and then you end it on that fifth, on the epilogue, which is like the 5th chapter, which is the New Year's Eve party. And so I just considered it's like, okay, so like, how are you going to be doing snapshots into like this character's life as well as the lives around them and figure out like what's going on, what changes have like people gone through like in the period of time that you're playing, and like when you're doing a not necessarily time skips, but you're not doing that day to day, like going into work and like clocking out and stuff like that. And so it was just really about nailing down the arcs that I wanted the characters to go through, and also like the diverging splits that they can go through as well as you can go through, and figuring out, you know, when does their story end, and where does your story end, and lining it all up together.
And that's always like the tricky part, knowing when the story comes to an end. And
Exactly.
I've interviewed like other developers who've gone into game dev, who've had like backgrounds in like film and other aspects, and they've always talked about that challenge of how much can you possibly get out of a story? Because as anyone knows, you can expand these out, but eventually get to that point where it just becomes like this mess, not only in terms of writing it, but having to sit through and read like
Yes,
10
yeah.
books worth of dialogue just to get to the good one ending of a game.
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah, because it is definitely like a big struggle. And I mean, I suppose that's why also there's a lot of allure to visual novels that have that one set story that you play through and don't have like open like other endings and things like that, like when you're actually making the game. And I suppose that's also what a lot of visual novel fans do want to play as well, depending on what their mood is. But with this it was really just like when you're writing a story anyway, you have to figure out how your character develops. And like, yes, obviously in a project like this, you're working with a lot of different characters, but that's kind of the same for any novel. And so you just have to be very strict with yourself and decide like what is going to be entertaining, you know, what's going to be meaningful writing, and then just kind of strip away the rest that's unnecessary. And it's just, I suppose, bloat about trying to make it a longer runtime or something like that. One of the ways that I have kind of tried to make it in this game so that you're getting like a fulfilling experience, but also you're not like going to be struggling to get to just one ending, and there's like a sense of replayability, is the fact that when you start in that first chapter, you are going to choose like what locations and what characters to talk to, and then that's going to kind of lock you in for the rest of the game. So you will only be interacting with like 2 to 3 characters each season rather than like a full cast. And yes, those characters kind of open you up to other locations, other characters too, but they play a very lesser role. And it's just about kind of maintaining it so that the world still feels real and big, but it's not actually like so overwhelming that you're kind of just slogging through a bunch of dialogue, and you're also not getting anywhere with the actual story itself because of your time is split between too many things.
Hmm. Yep. And with the replayability aspect of it, that's also important. Because if you expect someone to replay the game, it can feel like a slog to replay it one, two,
Yes.
three, or how many more times you want.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, it's always why like a skip option is quite valuable,
Hmm.
especially because the visual novels will traditionally have like a main storyline that you kind of can't escape. And like, yes, you can make different choices in that main storyline, but there's always going to be a level of like, oh, you're going through the beats that you've already gone through. And so it's like, yeah, you kind of want to get to the parts that you haven't seen and to be able to explore the areas of the world that you haven't seen.
Yep.
So yeah, like skip button is like kind of necessary in that aspect. And then just, of course, making sure that when you're playing it for the first time, you're still getting like a full experience if you only want to ever play it once. But if you have that intrigue to continue playing it again and try and get the other endings and to see what there like what other sides there are to the story and to the characters, then you can still have that and not feel like you're just rereading the same things over and over.
Hmm. And one other question that I want to ask you before we switch to our other topic, it's one I always like to ask first-time developers, so those are those that come from other backgrounds in media. With this being, like, as you said, going from doing fine arts to game dev and learning this whole thing, for any, like, new or starting out developers watching or listening to us, was there anything that was like particularly like either fascinating or like interesting as a challenge in terms of learning to do game dev for the first time?
I would definitely say like the programming, because that was kind of the thing that was like totally out of my wheelhouse, like at least the language that I was working in. Um, but it's I don't know. I think like in order to get into a different field, like you obviously have to have a certain level of interest in it, and you have to have a certain level of being able to motivate yourself to get through the parts that feel hard and to like welcome that and embrace that rather than reject it because of I know that for a lot of people when you're starting over in a way, like even though games have like a ton of art in them, and this is just the thing, like for me, like yeah, when like no matter what type of game you're playing, there's always artists involved. So like it's not that far out of reach for someone that's coming from a visual arts background of any sort, or even a writing background, like any kind of arts, because obviously we kind of consider game development and things like that more of like a STEM, like humanities versus STEM type of thing. And it's like, but the thing is, you're still going to be learning skills and like technical skills that are that have all the same beats of like what you've already actually done before, like because of learning is the same. It doesn't matter what you're learning, you still have to actually start from the bottom and then like gradually hone your skills. And I suppose it's just about embracing that fact, and also knowing you can do it. And then you start feeling really accomplished once things begin to pull together.
Hmm. And just getting that first game out is a major badge of honor that once it's very hard, I think, for a lot of people getting the game dev for the first time to get one game out the door, but it's the only way you really learn the whole process, and then you can apply that to whatever your next project is down the line.
Yeah, that's totally it. And that's also why I suppose it's good not to be like too precious about your first project either. Like obviously, yes, you want to be proud of it and you want to be able to look back and say like, yeah, I did everything that I wanted to do in it. But you also have to realize that like you could no matter what, you could work endlessly on it. But the most important part is actually to get it out there, to see what people say about it. And like obviously like it's an industry where it's like yeah, there's a lucky few where it's like their first project blows up massively and then like they get a huge amount of success from that, but it's about finding your own personal success in it and to be able to use what you learned from that first project to then go on and create other projects, and even to be able to use it like as a like I don't want to say a resume builder, but in order to be able to say like hey, here I did this, and like to go and also work with other people in your community and like work on their projects with them too, or to be able to find other people to work on other projects that you want to work like create and stuff like that. So yeah, it's just good to actually get it out there and to not hold on to it and not to baby it like forever.
Hmm. And yeah, there's so much to unpack with that for a lot of developers that we could spend a few hours just going over at that point
Yeah.
alone. But I do want to switch gears and kind of get to the other part of this conversation, and that is the funding side of this. Again, this
Yeah.
is your first game, and as we were talking about earlier, you did apply for a grant from the Australian government for kind of getting
Yes.
the funds to get this game going. And this is, I think, a point for a lot of like new and even maybe not so new developers listening to this, that the funding side is always one of the more frustrating aspects when it comes to game dev. And again, whether you are new, first time, or you've had many projects on your belt, I'm sure you can attest to that point. So, what I want to ask you about is kind of like what was like the process like to apply for the grant? Kind of like what kind of like attract you to going this route? Like kind of like give people like that part of the story.
Yeah, I suppose, my disclaimer is, like, don't don't necessarily do what I did because of I only found out about the grant 3 days before it actually closed. So it was, and it was kinda like a Hail Mary of being like, "Oh, wow," like, I didn't realize that the Australian government was doing, uh, grants for video games,
Mm,
and again, I was waiting for my, like, acceptance letter to see if I'd got into the courses that I'd applied to, and I just thought, like, "Hey, like, if I haven't, like, I'm gonna apply for some creative grants," and that's what I was doing initially, is I was looking for visual arts grants. I found then the Emerging Game Makers Fund, and yeah, it's definitely suited me because of, like, that's exactly what I am. Like, I hadn't made a video game before, and this was about kind of the Australian government is wanting to fund people to gain the skills that they need in order to break into the industry. And so that's what it is all about. It's about funding a prototype or a demo. And that's what I specifically went for. Um, and then from there, it was just like, yeah, I was lucky because of I had, like, the idea for the story, so it was very easy to put down onto paper and to fill out, like, the forms and all of that. But definitely when you're applying for funding, take your time with it. Like, it's good if you have a very strong idea of what you wanna do, but even so, like, definitely make sure you kinda, like, know what tier of funding you wanna look for, what's gonna be best suited for your project. And because that's the thing, like, even if, like, you get funding for, like, a prototype or a demo, you can still use that as, like, a pitch, whether that's going for private or for public funding further on. But I feel like it's just about kinda getting your foot in the door. And so, like, the idea of, like, again, not wanting to at first go fund the entire project that you're working on, but to fund parts of it that you can then use as, like, I suppose, a bargaining chip to try and find more funding afterwards and to also garner more interest in the project. That's a really important thing to keep in mind.
mm, yeah, and that's also a really good point because some people will think that when we're talking about funding in this respect, that is getting the entire game funded. Like we look at
Yeah.
something like crowdfunding with like Kickstarter or something like Indiegogo, a lot of people will. I've seen this mistake be made that they will, shoot for the moon with their funding. Like they will ask above and beyond, or they'll throw like a very ridiculous number, hoping to get the entire project funded. And
Yeah.
one of the downsides of that is that you are putting a lot of eggs in that one basket. Because maybe it does get the Kickstarter, maybe you do get that. But if you don't, then what is your recourse if it doesn't pan out?
Yeah, that's exactly it, and so I feel like setting smaller goals and to just focus on certain areas, because it's like, yeah, like, unfortunately, like, a lot of people do need to have other jobs in order to actually, like, do the things that they wanna do, and so you always have to keep that in mind, but I feel like when you're looking for funding, it's about looking for certain aspects where it's like what income you already have can't cover, and to think about the project in that way, rather than thinking like, "Oh, yeah, I'm just gonna, like, go for one and done and try and get the entire thing funded first try or just, like, first time." And because that's also the thing is, like, I personally I'm not, like, a huge social media person, so I haven't, like, gone the Kickstarter route or anything like that. I'm relying on government funding instead. But yeah, I suppose, like, you can always, like, raise money in other ways. Like, yeah, if you can, like, get a Kickstarter going and, like, get a smaller goal done, and then also, like, because you can continue getting funded past that goal anyway. You can have stretch goals and things like that, which you can always keep in mind. But there's other ways of making money too, and that's like about making merchandise. And especially once you already start getting that public interest, chances are people will be also interested in a certain amount of merchandising, and then you can use that to further put back into the work. Obviously, that takes a certain amount of money to begin with, but you can do things like relatively cheaply and easily, and still be able to continue working towards like actually getting the game finished.
Mhm. And one thing that I wanted to also mention for the people listening, like as you're describing about learning about the fund or applying for the grant 3 days before it was due, like one of the more interesting aspects is that every country has different appeals first. I think there's a few in New Zealand. I know there's been like
Yeah.
European government grants, Canada as well. Sadly, here in the United States, we have not had any of those. I would love maybe at some point to have like some kind of funding set up for that. I guess for people listening, how did you find out about the grant in the first place?
Yeah, that is also like something that Australia had in common with the US, is because of from what I know or from what I understood is that I was part of the second or third round of government funding that they were doing. So it was very early because of they had scrapped the project, like they had scrapped the department for it. I think in like 2012 or 2014 or something like that. So it hadn't actually, there were no government grants for video games at all until I think like 2022 or 2023. That's when they brought it back. And so yeah, like it's really just about like keeping your ears open, because if I also know like here in South Australia, they didn't have state grants either for video games, but that has just opened up last December. So I suppose it's something that's happening, and I think as countries like kind of understand that the games industry, like it does all come down to actually like boosting the economy. But I feel like as countries start to realize just how valuable the games industry is, there's going to be more interest in actually like having public support for it, rather than just private sector support for it. So it is really about keeping your ears and eyes like open, and just trying to figure out like if there's anything coming up or if there's anything even adjacent, because of like I don't know how it necessarily works in the US or in other countries, but even in terms of some visual arts projects, like you can use like, you can apply for visual art funding, and that can still be because like games are art depending on like how it's, designed and how you're actually working on the game itself. So you can go into different sectors and kind of try and find funds there as well to support a video game project, even though that's like a rather non-traditional way of going about things.
One question I wanted to ask you regarding the grant itself. You said that you've been working on the game like full time since about last January.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of the grant, like when did you actually like apply? Did you apply to the grant like after you started working on the game, or was it just like before you started focusing on it?
Yeah, no, I applied for the grant in February 2024.
Mhm.
I got confirmation about 12 weeks later or so, that I was successful. And then it took another like couple of months for the money to actually like get transferred.
Okay.
And so up until that point, that's why I didn't start working on it full time until January, because that's when I was actually able to. And also, obviously, at the same time, I was getting ready to actually move back overseas, and then start my PhD. And so it was kind of a big toss up between like, do I accept the grant or do I go and start studying again?
Mhm.
And so ultimately, obviously, I'm making the game, so I accepted the grant. And so yeah, there is a bit of a waiting game. I would suggest like if you can and you're able to, like definitely you should start working on your game while you're waiting like for confirmation, because regardless of whether you get the money or not, you can still have made progress, and then you can still apply for the next round as well and actually use that progress as like to show that you got this amount done like just by yourself, and also to just make it a more compelling proposal that you're putting forth. So that's like a pretty important thing. Like again, in my circumstances, because of I ended up getting my acceptance, so I was going to then like go and pursue studying. That's why I wasn't actually actively working on the game at the same time, and so that's why I only started working on it after I received the funding.
Hmm. And that's a good point about kind of like the state of the game. In terms, as you said, like, since you applied to this and you got in 2024, what were they like asking for in terms of like progress when you were submitting for the grant?
Yeah, so when I was actually writing my proposal, because it was the emerging game makers, you can submit like a prototype that you already have. And then obviously you're kind of like asking for further money to develop it a bit further and like get it to like I suppose a demo stage or like a different like a vertical slice, you know. So it but they also don't ask for too much. So they can fund ideas that are just based off of the pitch of the game itself rather than having any tangible like because they were also accepting like if you didn't have any concept art for the game you could actually also submit like I suppose like mood boards and things like that like to give an idea of like what style of art the game would have, but they do also obviously ask for more further details like what is the actual story, what is the point of the game that you're making, and like why it's important for you specifically, like in terms of your career development. And I suppose that's what is the most important aspect of those like entry level grant types of like you need to be pitching the idea, but you also have to be pitching yourself and why it's important for your career progression rather than purely just like, oh, I really, and like, and that's what really cuts out the successful grants versus the unsuccessful grants is people spend too much time talking about the actual concept or like how the game works rather than discussing like what it will be important, like how will it be an important cultural impact or an important economic impact, as well as how it's going to further your career.
Hmm. Yeah. And going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, being able to say that you finished a game and having that
Yes.
as part of your portfolio and as your resume. Because I'm sure there are people who got grants or applied who never got to finish a game or they just ended up just like, sputtering out. And obviously that doesn't help anyone on either side.
Yeah, that is. And that I suppose, I think there is a bit of a gap at the moment in terms of government funding, where I feel like because of at the moment we kind of have like with Screen Australia, there's like two camps, which is the Emerging Game Makers Fund that funds demos and prototypes, and then the Game Production Fund, which is supposed to like kind of get you to the end and to actually like have a completed project and like product that is put onto market. And I would love for there to be kind of like a middle section, which is about like getting, I suppose, prototypes and demos to like another stage of development, but not necessarily going like the full Monty, because of that is where, because there's simply like not enough money to actually go around, which is like the biggest hindrance. But it's
Hmm.
also like for a lot of people, it's like they have smaller scale projects and things like that because they're trying to get their first game out. So they can't really apply for the game production fund. And so it'd be nice if there's like a mid tier where it's like you're still going to be getting some extra support that you can't because like you can only get funding once for your prototype or demo with the Emerging Game Makers Fund. So to have something in the between to actually help get people to that final finish line, that would be fantastic to see. Because I feel like there's a lot of demos that are getting funded, but not like a lot of games that are actually getting finished because there's just like a lack of support there.
Hmm. Yep. And sadly, I've seen that a lot over the past 15 years. Games getting like a really good demo or getting some like really good
Mhm.
buzz, and then for whatever reason, progress just stalls and the developer gets burnt out and the project never gets finished, or something happens and there's just no way to get that game done. So we're just kind of left with the promise of what this game could have been.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really like because like obviously it's just sad to actually see these projects kind of die off because there's no external support. And like yeah, there's definitely ways that you can go and like you can like if you're lucky, you can get a publisher. If you're lucky, you can get private funding. But like that is a lot of that is luck based, to be honest. And it's just about knowing who to speak to and also just being able to garner enough interest in your project to begin with. And so it would be nice for there to be some sort of support for developers because of a lot of it comes down to funding and money issues because of there's just like you get a lot more time when you have funding behind you because you're able to actually focus on a project full time rather than split your time and attention between multiple things in order to actually get a game done. And then obviously when it comes to other things, like when you have money, you're able to actually hire other people too, because of like, as nice as it is to have people volunteer to help you, they also then will have to be funding themselves. And so it is nice to actually be able to hire people so they can help you on the game for, like 3 months, 6 months, whatever. But all of that actually requires money.
Yep. With as you're describing, like putting like the promotion or putting together the application for the grant, did they ask for like a rough idea of how long it would take you to finish the game? Did they get like into like that level specifics?
With the Emerging Game Makers Fund, it wasn't that specific. It was more so about like how long it will take to finish the prototype or demo.
Okay.
So there isn't a huge amount of detail in terms of that. When you're applying for the game production fund, that's when it becomes very important, and that's when there's like a lot of milestones that they're looking rather closely at in terms of like this is when like writing's going to be finished and this is when like you're going to be having play testing done and things like that. And like yes, they do ask for that in terms of like the demo, like in certain things of like this is when like the art is going to be finished and like this is when I'm going to be contacting like sensitivity readers or something like that or like play testers. But there's a bit more leeway in terms of like they're willing to accept if you need to push those goal posts a bit further along because there's like a hitch or you just like kind of run into a roadblock or something just takes a bit longer. But when it comes to the main production fund, it's a lot stricter because of obviously there's a lot more money behind these projects. And again, it's to actually push a game to be released.
I noticed on the store page that you have a publisher for Night Shift. Was that kind of process done like uh before the grant, or did that come about like after you started working on the game full time last year?
Yeah, no, that actually only happened in March of this year. So I was working kind of around the clock to just talk to as many people as possible. Also, like what was really lucky in terms of being funded by a government body is that I was invited to GCAP, and so that's where I made most of my connections of with other people in the industry because of my game was shown in the local lounge there. And so it was good to be able to actually have my game in front of like industry professionals who also have other contacts. And then I just basically spent those 3 days of that conference talking to as many people as possible, getting as many cards as possible, and just seeing who might be interested in actually publishing my game. Because especially like with games in general, whether it comes with extra funding or not, it's just nice to have the support of a publisher behind you because it gives a bit more credence. It can put your game out there a bit more to, the public eye. And also it comes with some, like, depending on the deal that you end up getting, it can come with marketing, it can come with localization, it can come with all sorts of different things, console support. So depends on what you're looking for, but yeah, it was a lot of just talking to people and trying to make connections, and then from those connections, seeing who would be interested, and also like what publishing house would be like a good fit for this project, because obviously it's a bit on the niche side, and it is like horror adjacent, things like that. So you kind of have to find out someone that's interested in like interactive fiction, I suppose, as well as like just the general genre of the actual game. Because of a lot of visual novel publishers, like they might be interested in visual novels, but they might not be interested in like horror visual novels.
Hmm. And like it's something that I've seen from a lot of developers I've talked with and a few that I've done like consulting with, that challenge of finding the right publisher, whether it's a strategy game, visual novel, horror, RPG, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it took a lot of hustling, to be honest. But it was, yeah. I mean, it's part of it, and you just kind of have to come to embrace that and know that, like, if you're really passionate about this, there has to be a certain level of motivation to put yourself out there and to actually not be afraid to talk to people.
Hmm. I guess with that, any other aspects regarding the grant side, applying, that we haven't touched on that you would like to bring up?
Let me just have a think. I think in terms of like, yeah, putting together like applications for grants or for funding, um, there's a lot of different like private funding, like pitching platforms and stuff like that. And that's also where I was putting my game out after I got my public funding. And so that definitely helped, is to put the game out, is to find different like like Zola. That's what I was using in order to actually like put my game out there and to see, because they have like a funding club, and to see if it would get any interest just based off a proposal, because you always have to put together a pitch deck anyway, and that was kind of like the biggest thing, is like refining my pitch deck and just making sure it's like up to par and kind of like goes over everything that I'm asking for, and again has a timeline that matches up with what I'm able to do, or like that what I'm pitching to do. And so yeah, I suppose that's like really the most important part, is like make sure your pitch deck is like solid, because there's like a lot of them out there these days. There's a lot of games that are looking for money. And then again, narrowing down from there, who would be interested in your game, where it would be well situated, and just so you're not just like aimlessly kind of throwing it out there. But also, again, you kind of have to cast a wide net, because sometimes there'll be people that are interested in your game that you wouldn't have already, like, you wouldn't have anticipated there might be interest there, because they might be opening up a different like outlet, and things like that. So it's about being open, it's about being prepared, and it's just about kind of having the materials there already and doing that hard work beforehand. So then, like, the all you have to do is really press send, and just try and talk to people.
Yep. And the pitch side, I think there's a topic in of itself, because I know a lot of people struggle with that idea of how do I present this game to someone, let alone a committee, a grant board, or even just to someone, on the street or in a convention, about
Oh yeah.
getting them excited about this game.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, it's a lot of practice, really. Like, you have to have a certain level of self-confidence. You have to have a certain level of confidence, and it can be hard to muster that up. Especially like when you're entering into, like, for me, when I was entering into a space for like the first time, a lot of the time it was like I don't really know what the proper protocol is. But I think that also can help in a way, because of it's like, yeah, I mean, like, at the end of the day, you're talking to another human being, like, whether that's like on a committee and it's like a faceless committee, there are humans there that are actually overlooking your things. And so it's just about being open to the fact that there are like a certain amount of like errors that are allowed, but like obviously try to avoid them, but don't put too much pressure on yourself to be absolutely perfect and to have things absolutely watertight. It's just about like being able to actually put your foot in the door first. And then as you go on, you start getting better and you start refining it and you start figuring out, oh, this is like the types of things that people like to hear, and like this is what actually gets people interested in the game, and things like that. Because it does take a bit of refining, but all you can do is practice.
And I think that is a good point to begin to wrap things up for our conversation. So, with that, just a few final questions for you, and then we'll say goodnight. So, as we talked about earlier, there are plans on making a formal announcement for the release of Night Shift. Probably by the time this cast will go up, there's a good chance that announcement will be made. So, one question I always like to ask developers: do you have any thoughts as to what you're going to do next in terms of a game after it?
Afterwards, yeah, I mean, I would really like to continue making games, I suppose, in the universe that I'm setting up here, which is obviously our reality. But it would be nice to actually continue making titles that are kind of loosely connected. Because I've found as I've been making this, there's a lot of things that I want to put into this game, but for time restrictions and in order to stop myself from again working endlessly on it, it will be nice to actually make a game afterwards that's like Not necessarily a sequel or a prequel, but just kind of set in the same themes, same art style, same things, and just continue working. But, I suppose not doing purely interactive fiction.
Do you see yourself still continuing kind of like the setting of Sydney, or do you see yourself going to any other like mythologies or any other like territories?
I think I would probably do one either based off of my experiences living in London or my experiences living in Zurich. Because, yeah, I just feel like there's a lot of other cities out there, especially like in terms of German-speaking countries. Usually you're seeing games, that are primarily firstly released in German. Um, and so it'd be nice to actually be able to release something that explores Zurich specifically or Switzerland, which is my home, and show it to a an English speaking audience.
Great. So I guess my final question for you before we wrap things up: do you have any like to say about developing Night Shift, about the grant? Any final thoughts to take us out?
No, I think everything's been covered.
Well, Georgina, it has been a pleasure chatting with you tonight. Best of luck with wrapping up the development of Night Shift. And yep, if you're free in the future, come back on and talk about whatever your next project is. Definitely feel free to reach out.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to talk about this. And yeah, I hope that if any developers are listening that want to go for funding, that they just go for it. I think that's my motto is always you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Hmm. And for people listening, I'll include a link to the store page for Night Shift down below. Do you have any social media you would like to promote?
Yes, you can find social media for Night Shift 999. Most of it is underneath the handle Winterschloss or Winterschloss Studios. I have a TikTok, an Instagram, Blue Sky, and Twitter.
All right. So with that, we will be saying goodnight for our chat. For those of you listening, be sure to check out Night Shift 1999. And for everyone on YouTube here, do all that YouTubing stuff. Check out my Discord, Patreon, buy all the many copies of my books. Again, thank you so much for coming on. I know it is, I think, is it about like early afternoon where you're at, considering the time zone?
No, it's 10:13 a.m. right now.
Okay, well, I will let you go so you can start your day again. Best of luck with the game, and hopefully we can chat again more in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Not a problem. So, for you watching, be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where you some of the art and science of games. As I said at the start, if you're a developer wanting to come on and chat about your game or an aspect of game dev, be sure to get in touch. And with that, have a great rest of your day, and see everyone for our next conversation.